I've done it. I've finally figured out why the Mimic was buried below the Pizzaplex, how it connects to the new game Secret of the Mimic, and how we fit all the puzzle pieces together to fit within the lore. This is the most comprehensive explanation I've seen on the internet, so buckle in because this is the real reason why the Mimic was buried below the Pizzaplex. And immediately I'd like to start by addressing one thing: Jackie from the Secret of the Mimic trailer. Yes, Jackie is the Mimic. How do we know this? Well, the game is literally called Secret of the Mimic, so we know that the main antagonist, which is Jackie, is going to be the Mimic. Not to mention that the developers themselves have said this is the Mimic's origin story. We also know the game will be set at the earliest point we've ever seen in the timeline, which is 1979, because we see that ingrained on the trailer. So if this new game is the earliest point in FNAF's history, how is it now going to relate to the latest point in FNAF's history, which is Five Nights at Freddy's security breach's ruin? Remember where we see it buried below the Pizzaplex? So how did it even get there? Well, for us to actually figure that out, we need to know where it actually started. Unlucky for us, we know where to look, because at PAX they obviously had a demo of Secret of the Mimic, where various content creators and members of the public were able to play this. Now it's set in some type of factory where they're making mascot suits come to life, turning them into animatronics, right? And this is where we first see Jackie. She's basically like a giant Jack in the box, but eventually throughout the demo she does lose her box and is just an upper torso. Now immediately I'd like to address something here. Jackie is clearly a clown or a jester, and the Mimic we see in Ruin doesn't have any casing on it at all, or even a costume. But I'll get onto that later. I'd like to immediately say that in the novels, the Mimic does actually use a court jester costume to surprise his victims. So it's not unheard of that the Mimic does actually dress up like a jester or a clown. We also know that the factory we're playing in the demo is extremely old. It has a wooden shell, kind of like cladding as well, and it features the mascots we see in Ruin's ending. You know, the mascot costumes we see against the wall in the Mimic's room where he was buried below the Pizzaplex. You know, the elephant costume, the lion, the duck costume, they were all there in this original factory. Obviously, they were nowhere near as withered as we see him in Ruin's ending. I mean, it's nearly 50 years later, so they're obviously going to be all decrepit. So it makes you ask the question, how did they get there? The Mimic, supposedly, and other attractions we see on the cameras. You can clearly see a carousel here. Now, what is extremely interesting about this is that we know a carousel was in the Pizzaplex. Now, I know, you're probably thinking, well, where was this carousel then, Twisted? We didn't see her in Security Breach. Well, we might not have seen it, but it was definitely there, because the book VIP tells us there was a carousel ride. He describes it exactly the same as the carousel we see in Help Wanted 2, which is another great connection right there. And we know Help Wanted 2's events was set between the events of Security Breach and Ruin. You know, where we're basically helping train these new endoskeletons, doing Roxy's makeup, etc. So that carousel we see in the CCTV footage could actually be the carousel we see 50 odd years into the future in the Pizzaplex. But again, I know you're probably asking how. This carousel is clearly being made at this factory, along with the mascot suits we've seen in that room, along with the Mimic, which we've seen in that room. So how have they ended up below the Pizzaplex then, Twisted? Well, we know that the factory could have clearly have made the carousel, right, and transported it there. That makes sense. But what about the mascots, the Mimics? Why would they be transported there? Especially as you can see, these mascot suits were extremely old. It wasn't as if they'd remade them. They brought the old decrepit suits over. You know, Security Breach is basically set at any point between 2025 and 2035. Even at that point, that's 40 to 50 years of old suits. Now, they could have easily have transported them for the old pizzeria, which we know was below the Pizzaplex. They could have been an attraction there, because let's not forget, this pizzeria below the Pizzaplex is the FNAF 6 pizzeria, which could even be older than that, because the FNAF 6 pizzeria was basically a repurposed Freddy's. It could be the original Freddy's restaurant, which when they had the factory up and running in 1979, they were preparing for the release of the brand new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. They actually have a poster on the wall saying coming soon. They could have been making these mascots, these attractions, ready for the grand opening. They shipped them there and used them in the grand opening, which plays into a huge theory I had on the actual Mimic being one of the original members of the Fazbear gang. Now, I would like to say, however, I don't believe this to be the case now, because something has come to light which blows this theory, I think, out of the water, and I never even thought of it at first. Now, I'm not saying the theory I did is wrong, because there's some pretty substantial evidence I used in that video to back up what I've just said. You know, the Mimic being one of the original members, you know, the paper pals, etc. And it makes sense. But this theory, I think, makes even more sense. Remember when I said the original mascots we see in the Mimic's room were there? You know, specifically the elephant mascot? That was seen in Ruin's room, but it was also seen in the factory. So all but confirmed it's the same mascot. We know the Mimic is also in this room. And then you start to look at everything else around this specific room. It's very old, decrepit, and the walls are actually made out of wood. Now, at no point in any of the FNAF history is any of the pizzerias been made out of wood. The only place we know of is this brand new factory. It's described again as having wooden walls and cladding. And then it hit me. What if the Mimic, these mascots, and everything else didn't leave the old factory because they built the Pizzaplex on top of this old destroyed factory? They simply sealed the Mimic in, along with these original mascot suits. They were never transported there. They never left the factory. I mean, the wooden walls make sense. The aesthetic makes sense. This is the factory. The fact that it connects to all these caves, all these other places we haven't seen yet. This is the secret of the Mimic. In the demo at PAX, it mentions several floors, where you're descending several floors in this wooden-like structure. As we are descending down below the Pizzaplex, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're descending several floors in this wooden structure. John from the FNAF channel also makes this exact same connection.
And then we basically get into the chase sequence. So now we're basically running from this Jack-in-the-Box thing through like the underground depths of this place. It looked very old, very wooden, kind of like the structure we see in Ruin, like the staircases to get down to the Mimic. It looked like that kind of. I didn't put that together until just now.
But there are several things we need to talk about and address here. 1, the Mimic has legs. 2, we actually see a scooper room in one of the endings. So how is this all possible? Well, first off, we know the Mimic has been down there a very long time. Gregory says this himself.
I really don't know what it is, but it's been trapped down here a really long time.
That backs up the fact that the Mimic could have been down there for several decades. Now granted, a very long time is subjective wording. A very long time to me could be a couple of months, where a very long time to someone else could be a few years. That leaves wiggle room for any other potential theories. But let's say in this case, a very long time means 40 plus years. And the cameras we see back up this time skip, because looking at the locations we see in these CCTV cameras, you can clearly see aesthetically they look nearly identical to the sinkhole where we descend down. You know, where we see all the wooden cladding, the wooden walls. And again, the design choice of this area we see in Ruin looks almost identical to the design choice we see in the demo. The aesthetic matches perfectly. All of this is lining up to suggest that the factory was indeed below the Mega Pizzaplex, just like the FNAF 6 location. I mean, even as we're running through the ending of Ruin, in the caves, we see a cardboard cutout of Freddy. You know, referencing Freddy's family diner, exactly like we see the coming soon posters from the factory. Why would this cardboard cutout of Freddy seemingly make it all the way below the Mega Pizzaplex? Well, simple, it didn't go anywhere. It's been below the Pizzaplex the entire time, always been there. Now, what about the Mimic in it actually gaining legs? Because obviously, in Ruin, we see the Mimic with legs, and in the demo, Jackie doesn't have any at all. Now, believe it or not, they actually have an answer for this in the novels. They travel to this abandoned factory, which again could be below the Pizzaplex, where they find the Mimic, Jackie, and they decide to retrofit it with a pair of legs. Now, I'm not saying that is the case here, because when we play Secret of the Mimic, Jackie herself could easily retrofit her own legs, you know, as the story develops. But the option for Fazbear Entertainment employees to retrofit the legs has been explored in the novels. Further to this, we also know there was going to be a carnival type area in the room where we find the Mimic. This was eventually cut, but was definitely foreshadowing an area in relation to Secret of the Mimic, which could have easily have displayed more evidence that the factory was below the Pizzaplex. It all then starts to make sense why the Mimic wants to escape. I mean, it's probably been down there since 1979, and it's wanted to escape ever since. Good 40, 50 plus years it's been down there. That's why it's so desperate to escape. But the big question here is, why is there a scooper room? Now, many people theorize that it was the sister location scooper, which doesn't make sense because they're two completely different scoopers. You can see that in the design choice. But what isn't clear about the scooper in Ruin's ending is whether it injects remnant or not. Because if it doesn't, it could clearly be a scooper which was used in the factory to bring out the endoskeletons, right? Because obviously, the Mimic doesn't have a shell on at this point. It could have been scooped out of the Jester costume. But here's the really interesting thing. If that scooper did inject remnant, just like the other scooper did, then what if they scooped out the Mimic and also injected it with remnant? That would then explain its drive to leave, its ability to constantly be charged, because you gotta remember, this is a 1979-year-old animatronic. It's not gonna have the advanced charging capabilities. We know that old animatronics used to have a battery next to them on the stage. Just look at Mr. Hippo, for example. He had a battery pack right next to him on the floor. So it could explain how the Mimic potentially has got a form of sentience, because it's been injected with remnant. But again, all this is just a theory. But one I definitely think explains how the Mimic could be below the Pizzaplex, why it's been down there for such a long time, how these mascot suits have been there from the factory, and how it connects the secret of the Mimic to the actual Mimic in Ruin's ending. But what do you think on this theory? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. But there's something else I really need to ask you about Ruin's ending. We see ruined Roxy come and save Cassie, right? But there's actually hidden dialogue and something she was trying to say to Cassie. And if you want to know what that is, I'd highly recommend checking out this video. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's plenty of content just like this on the channel, and I release a video like this every week. With a huge thanks to my members on screen now, and a special thanks to William Plays and Lauren C, who are golden twisted ones, and Penguin Lover 12, who's actually a twisted animatronic and ultimate theorist. Thanks guys. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe out there, superstars.